All right, on to the House. It voted today to rebuke President Trump's tariffs on Canada. 6 Republicans joined Democrats, passing a resolution to repeal those tariffs. It seeks to end the national emergency that the president declared to impose those tariffs. But the rare bipartisan vote against the White House agenda is largely symbolic. Actually, undoing the policy would require support from Trump himself. The resolution is now heading to the Senate.
This is how alliances collapse. Not with a declaration of war, not with tanks rolling across a border, but with a social media post and a threat to shut down a bridge that hasn't even opened yet. The United States is now openly menacing its closest ally on earth, and the man doing it is not some rogue general or fringe senator. It is the President of the United States. Again. What just happened in Washington is not normal. It is not tough negotiating. It is not strategic leverage. It is the weaponization of economic power against a Democratic partner for the sake of political domination. And for the first time in months, the fracture lines are showing inside his own party. The House of Representatives, narrowly controlled by Republicans, voted to overturn the president's tariffs on Canada. 6 members of his own party broke ranks. 6. In a chamber where defiance is usually career suicide. The vote was 219 to 211. That number matters. It is not symbolic dissent whispered behind closed doors. It is recorded rebellion. The president responded the only way he knows how. Threats, primaries, retaliation, loyalty tests. He warned that those who dared oppose him would suffer consequences at the ballot box. Read that again. The head of the executive branch threatening legislators for voting on behalf of their constituents. That is not party politics. That is coercion dressed up as leadership. Strip away the noise and the bravado. What actually happened? He launched a trade war against Canada using emergency powers never intended for tariff disputes. He justified it by invoking national security, citing fentanyl and border concerns, even though the data does not support the claim that Canada is driving the crisis. He imposed sweeping tariffs. Then he escalated them. Then he threatened to double them to 100% on all Canadian goods if Canada finalized a trade agreement with China. 7 days earlier, he said such a deal would be a good thing. 7 days. That is not policy evolution. That is volatility. And then came the bridge. The Gordie Howe International Bridge, a nearly $5 billion infrastructure project connecting Detroit to Windsor, financed largely by Canada, negotiated years ago, endorsed by this very president in a prior term as a vital economic link. Construction began in 2018, thousands of jobs attached, reduced crossing times, strengthened supply chains. He threatened to block its opening unless the United States was fully compensated, unless America received half ownership of a bridge Canada paid for. Think about the message that sends to every ally watching. If you invest in shared infrastructure with the United States, the deal is valid only until the president wakes up and decides he wants more. This is not transactional politics. This is the logic of extortion. And here is where it becomes larger than a tariff fight. The Constitution grants Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Article 1, Section 8. Clear text. Over decades, Congress delegated limited authority to presidents under statutes like the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That law was designed for genuine national emergencies, hostile states, terrorism, sudden crises. It was not written to allow a president to unilaterally re-engineer trade relationships with Democratic allies to score domestic political points. When emergency powers become a routine economic tool, you no longer have emergency governance. You have executive overreach normalized through repetition. Courts are now weighing whether this tariff regime even survives constitutional scrutiny. A federal appeals court has already signaled skepticism. If the Supreme Court ultimately rules that these actions exceed statutory authority, the entire structure collapses. Not because markets protested, not because voters complained, but because the law still matters, unless it doesn't. Because here is the pattern. Declare an emergency, expand power, attack critics, frame dissent as betrayal. Repeat, it is the same playbook used against the press, against prosecutors, against state officials. The institutions become obstacles, not guardrails. Look at the political implications. Canada is the top export market for dozens of American states. Nearly $3 billion in goods cross that border every single day. Auto parts travel back and forth multiple times before a vehicle reaches a dealership. Energy flows south. steel, aluminum, uranium, agricultural products, integrated supply chains built over decades. A 100% tariff is not a negotiating tactic. It is economic self-harm. Inflation spikes, energy prices rise, manufacturing costs climb, small businesses face unpredictable expenses based on whatever appears in a morning post. Members of Congress are hearing from farmers, from auto workers, from manufacturers who cannot plan for next quarter because they do not know what policy will exist next week. That uncertainty is not abstract. It is payroll. It is mortgages. It is hiring decisions postponed. And when 6 Republicans break ranks, it is not because they suddenly discovered bipartisanship. It is because they can read the polling in their districts. Approval ratings are underwater. Independent voters are drifting away. When a president's net approval hovers deep in negative territory heading into midterms, history is not kind to the governing party. But this story is not just about electoral math. It is about how democracies treat allies. Canada is not an adversary state. It is a NATO partner, a co-founder of NORAD, a nation with which the United States shares the longest undefended border in the world. For generations, that relationship was described as unshakable, quietly dependable. Now its prime minister is traveling the world warning about economic coercion by larger powers. He does not need to say the name. The implication hangs in the air. When middle powers begin organizing to insulate themselves from Washington, that is not strength. That is reputational erosion. And here's the strategic irony. The harder the pressure, the more incentive Canada has to diversify. Trade talks with Beijing, expanded ties elsewhere, increased defense spending to reduce dependency. Every threat accelerates the drift. This is what happens when foreign policy is driven by grievance rather than strategy. Allies become leverage points. Agreements become bargaining chips. Stability becomes weakness in the eyes of a leader who equates unpredictability with dominance. Inside the Republican Party, something else is happening. A quiet recognition that blind loyalty has limits when economic pain becomes local and immediate. The speaker attempted to block votes procedurally. That shield cracked. Once members were forced to go on record, some chose their districts over the president. That is a small rebellion. But in a chamber with a razor-thin majority, small rebellions matter. The president's response was not persuasion. It was intimidation, primary threats, public shaming. This is how internal dissent is disciplined in movements that prize personal loyalty over institutional independence. Congress becomes an extension of executive will rather than a co-equal branch. The founders designed friction into the system. Ambition counteracting ambition. When legislators fear retaliation more than they value separation of powers, that friction disappears. And without friction, power concentrates. Imagine the precedent if this continues unchecked. A president can invoke emergency authority to impose sweeping tariffs on any country for loosely defined security reasons. He can threaten infrastructure projects negotiated years earlier. He can punish lawmakers for exercising oversight. And the only constraints are electoral cycles and judicial review. That is a fragile balance. We are told this is hard-nosed deal-making, that allies must be pressured to contribute more, but effective negotiation does not rely on public humiliation and erratic escalation. It relies on credibility. When policy shifts within days based on mood or media reaction, credibility evaporates. Markets notice, diplomats notice, voters notice. And beneath the economic debate lies a psychological through line. The fixation on loyalty, the intolerance of dissent, the framing of disagreement as treachery. Those are not traits of confident democratic leadership. They are traits of movements that center authority in a single individual. History offers warnings. Democracies do not fall overnight. They erode through normalization. Each extraordinary action becomes the new baseline. Emergency powers become routine. Threats become language. Allies become adversaries when convenient. The bridge is a metaphor whether he intended it or not. A literal structure designed to facilitate connection, now held hostage in a dispute manufactured for leverage. When a leader threatens to block a bridge that benefits his own citizens to extract symbolic concessions, it reveals the hierarchy of priorities. Power first, optics second, stability somewhere near the bottom. What happens next depends on 3 arenas: the courts, the markets, and the voters. The judiciary may reassert statutory limits. Markets may react harshly to sustained volatility. Voters may decide that chaos is not a growth strategy, or the normalization continues, because that is the most dangerous outcome. Not a dramatic collapse, not a constitutional showdown broadcast in prime time, but a gradual acceptance that this is simply how things work now. That emergency declarations are tools of convenience, that allies are disposable, that congressional independence is optional. When the House vote occurred, you could almost feel the hesitation in the chamber. Members calculating risk, calculating backlash, calculating whether defiance is survivable. That is not how healthy parties operate under healthy presidencies. And yet here we are. The United States is testing the resilience of its own constitutional architecture in real time. It is testing whether separation of powers is structural or merely aspirational. It is testing whether alliances built over generations can withstand leadership that views relationships through the narrow lens of personal dominance. This is bigger than tariffs, bigger than one bridge. It is about whether governance becomes performance art fueled by grievance or remains a disciplined exercise constrained by law. If you believe this moment is minor, look at the pattern. Escalate, threaten, attack dissent, invoke emergency authority, repeat. Each cycle pushes the boundary a little further. Democracy rarely announces its tipping points in advance. Stay alert, watch the courts, watch the votes, watch the reaction from allies who are quietly recalibrating their trust in Washington. Missing these signals means waking up to consequences that feel sudden but were years in the making.